Hi everybody, this is Traci Chen and welcome back to my channel, My Great Australian Dream. I'm the principal lawyer at Mason Chen Law Group. We are a law firm based across Australia and we have lawyers and migration agents working in every single state basically in Australia. Today, I want to talk about the requirements for an Australian employer to become a standard business sponsor, which generally allows them to sponsor overseas workers. You may have heard of this requirement when people apply for visas such as the 482 temporary skill shortage or the 186 employer nomination scheme. The business first, the employer, the business, has to first become a standard business sponsor to be able to sponsor overseas workers. So hopefully this video will be able to help you and kind of guide you on the requirements so that you know what the department are kind of looking for. Now, although this application, I highly recommend for it to be handled by a migration lawyer or an agent, it's good for you to just have some sort of idea whether you are the employer or the visa applicant so that there are no surprises when you go to do the application. Now, before I jump into it, please don't forget to like and subscribe and share this video with people who need it. So today we're talking about standard business sponsorship. An Australian business that wants to sponsor overseas workers needs to become a standard business sponsor. And this application is made with the Department of Home Affairs. In short, we call it SBS. So if I say SBS throughout the video, this is what I'm actually referring to. Usually you need to be a standard business sponsor to be able to sponsor overseas workers on the 482 temporary skill shortage visa or the 186 employer nomination scheme, which is basically a follow-on from the 482 because some 482 applicants, those who qualify, can apply for PR. And I've done different videos on this. I'll drop it in the comments below because there's all these different types. And then also there's been all these different changes. So it's just probably better I just drop the individual links below. But basically, let's do a deep dive into the requirements for an Australian business. Okay, so overall, I don't think the requirements are too hard. It's basically the requirements of any Australian business. So first of all, the business must be lawfully operating in Australia, legally established and currently operating. I'll go through the supporting documents all together afterwards. So that's the first requirement. Now, for the sake of this video, I'm just going to refer to Australian businesses. There are some instances when the business overseas can sponsor as well, but I'll do another separate video on that because that gets very complicated. So second of all, there must be no adverse information regarding the business. And this gets a little bit tricky because, what's the definition of adverse information? So this can relate to the business, can relate to the directors of the business. So the business has to have a clean record. I'll give you an example of a business that has adverse information. So these standard business sponsorships that you apply for, once you apply and it gets granted, these last 5 years. So 5 years at a time. So once you have 5 years, you continue sponsoring overseas workers and every 5 years you need to renew it. So there was this client who employed some overseas workers, and this actually happens quite often, is that the department can actually go out and audit the business. So like during COVID, this obviously didn't happen. Maybe they made phone calls, but previously before COVID, and they may start doing it again, is that these officers will rock up at your business, and it's not like a raid or anything like that. So nothing like that, but they will just go in and they'll be, hey, we're from the Department of Home Affairs. We want to check these things. So they could check things such as the roster to see if the employee that you're sponsoring is rostered on and they're working. With 482s, they're meant to be working, full time. So on that roster, if you've got, for example, a restaurant manager, well, they should be rostered on full time. The other thing that they do look at is wages. So one of the requirements, and I've put this in my videos, is when you do the nomination, you have to pay them a certain market salary rate. So for example, for a restaurant manager, it might be $65,000 to $75,000. And so if you nominate $70,000, you have to pay that amount to them. And if they go in and they do check your books, and they look at the pay slips for that cafe manager that we just spoke about, and they're being paid below that, then the employer, the sponsor, can actually be sanctioned and be barred from applying again. So in that situation, the employer had the standard business sponsorship cancelled. So I think we were 3 years in. When they went to apply for it after it, so they had it cancelled and maybe they were barred for say 2 years. So after that 2 years, they can go and apply for the SBS again. And at that time, they need to declare that information because that is adverse information. That's an example. Maybe, for example, there was an ongoing court case between the ATO and the employer, the directors for, outstanding taxes or something like that. I'd say that would also be adverse information. So if there's anything like that, please reach out to your migration agent or lawyer so that you can discuss this in detail with them and they can advise you properly on it. Sometimes you forget whether you are the employer or the visa applicant. You go about your day and some things are going on. When you do these things, I guess you don't really think about it as well. So very important. So yeah, that's the second requirement, no adverse information about the business. So thirdly, they recently added this in. The business must actually have a strong commitment to employing local Australians first before they hire overseas workers. However, the department and the government do understand that at the end of the day, Australia doesn't have the largest population and there's lots of potential here in Australia. And sometimes that requires businesses to be able to seek talent, to seek skilled workers from overseas to fill these positions to help grow the business, which in turn should help to grow the business so the business can continue to employ local employees. When they're looking at applications, they just need to be satisfied that there's a good ratio of Australian workers compared to non-Australian workers, and there's no discriminatory practices where they only hire people from overseas. And that's why they also did introduce market salary rate, because they didn't want any disadvantages where employers are paying people from overseas, less than they would to an Australian. So that's kind of like the basic requirements to lodge a standard business sponsorship. But let's talk about the documents that you would attach. So in the application, there are all sorts of things in relation to the ABN, the ASIC registration of the business, how many employees you have, what the split of it is. So how many are Australian, how many are overseas, how many are student visa workers, how many are 457s, like they ask all those questions. So first of all, in terms of documentation, you need to prove that your business is legally established. So you will attach documents such as your ABN, Australian Business Number, and ABRN, which is a registration certificate for an overseas business that is registered to operate here in Australia. Some businesses can be an ASIC company extract, or if the company is publicly listed here in Australia, a copy of the ASX listing. And obviously in Australia, there's all different types of company structures. So for example, if they're operating as a trust or a joint venture, you'd have supporting documents for that, such as the trust deed. Now, sole traders can definitely sponsor as well. I've had this question quite a lot. As long as there's an ABN, sole traders can also sponsor. So that first part I talked about helps meet the requirements of the first requirement I said, which is lawfully established in Australia. This second set of documents will prove that it's operating currently in Australia. So that really comes down to the financial documents. So first of all, profit and loss statements. They usually ask for the last 2 years of tax returns. If the business is less than, 12 months old or just 12 months old, obviously you can provide what you have. I usually submit the last 24 months of BAS statements. However, usually they look for the last 12 months. So business activity statements, which needs to be lodged by businesses every quarter. That shows that the business is currently operating and has up-to-date figures. Recent bank statements as well, which shows the transactions in the business, which is super important. And then you kind of have other supporting documents which would help the application. So for example, a lease agreement. Most offices, a lot of commercial premises have lease agreements. For some businesses, you might have commercial agreements. So for example, a trading business, you may have contracts with other companies, for your trading purposes. And you could also provide other documents in relation to your staff. So for example, organizational charts, which is usually quite important, as well as rosters, especially in hospitality businesses, which shows who's rostered on, kind of how all the shift work works there. Now, these documents also have to look right. So for example, if there's like a huge loss in the company, then I think that needs to be explained. So usually we request for a letter from the accountant to provide a supporting statement that the business has enough funds to continue to operate soundly and also be able to sponsor the new employee and effectively afford the wages. Because if the business is showing a huge loss, then how else can they afford the wages? If the business has been around for less than 12 months, I would probably attach a business plan to show the ongoing expansion plans and how the business plans to go from 0 to 5 to 12 to 20 employees. So these supporting documents should be provided for the application to be processed and essentially approved. Once the business has a standard business sponsorship, then they can apply to sponsor overseas workers. So essentially it's like 3 steps. So standard business sponsorship, employer nomination, and then the visa. However, the standard business sponsorship only needs to be done once and then it lasts 5 years. So then you just keep renewing every 5 years essentially. The nomination needs to be done for each employee. So it doesn't matter if it's the same occupation, you need to do one for each employee. And obviously the visa application needs to be for each employee. The cost for this, you're looking at $420, which is not a lot. But the nomination and the visa costs a lot more, and I've discussed that in my other videos. So that was a very brief overview on the requirements for a standard business sponsor in Australia. So if you're an employer looking to sponsor overseas workers, or you're an employee and you know that your employer is interested in sponsoring you, then this would be the first step. Don't forget there's other steps after this. It's not an easy process, but most definitely when a business is looking for a specific skill or just cannot find enough skilled workers to fill the positions here in Australia, it's most definitely worth it. A lot of companies use this program, and I say like a lot. So don't be afraid to reach out to your employer. I would definitely get a lawyer or a migration agent to always assist with these type of applications. They're not easy. When there's commercial business documents involved, there's a lot of things you need to look at. So don't forget, we are a law firm. If you do need any assistance, feel free to drop us a query in the link below. Thank you so much, and I'll see you guys in the next video.